Welcome back to Community Navigation in Action, where we talk honestly about the systems, people, and lived experiences behind community care. Today's episode is one that I feel like is especially relevant because it's something so many of us feel but rarely say out loud. We're talking about burnout, but not burnout as an individual flaw or a lack of resilience. We're talking about burnout as a community signal, a reflection of the conditions people are navigating every day. And I couldn't think of a better person to unpack this with than today's guest, Richard Schutz, the voice behind Voice of Rich. Richard brings honesty, lived experience, and a kind of grounded wisdom that cuts through the noise. Richard, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate those kind words to start things off. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here to have this important dialogue today. So thank you.
Absolutely. So how are you feeling coming into this conversation today?
I mean, excited. I think any opportunity where, open and honest conversations can happen really goes and chips away at, a lot of other things that we're noticing, throughout the sector, throughout these networks of work that we all do. So I'm very, very eager and excited to break things down and talk about it.
Absolutely. So let's go on ahead and get started. When you hear the word burnout, what does it mean to you beyond the usual just I'm tired definition? Like, what does burnout actually look or feel like in real life?
Yeah, and great question. When it comes to burnout, you see that as human beings, we're all a little different. Everybody shows that in a certain different way. I think there is opportunity, and maybe that's the word that I'm thinking of right now, because again, those are signs. So what we do with those signs that really matter. I remember feeling burnout at one point. I remember having my own peers, other folks that I've worked with, either getting close or getting to that point. And I think there's just something powerful of understanding what does that look like for you as an individual. What does that look like as you as a leader, watching out for your team, that you're navigating these different types of things together. So I think when I think of burnout, I think of opportunity to be able to be intentional on, all right, what are things that we can do? What are things that we can be proactive? Because again, I'm sure for many of the people listening in today might empathize with the thought of burnout or kind of going through those feelings. But sometimes the intentionality behind what happens next is oftentimes can be a gap, or understanding what might work better for a team versus an individual versus, different cultures of different parts of the country doing this type of work. So I think there's a lot that can be unpacked in there, really understanding what that looks like. I mean, sometimes when we're answering calls and we're having these conversations with people, through lived experience, mental health concerns, a lot of different types of things. Sometimes we see that with the people that we're helping out, but who's here to really help out the helpers? Again, I'm happy and excited to continue to unpack this with you.
Yeah, so you've talked before about how burnout isn't just an individual experience, it's something you feel across the whole community. What are some of the earliest signs that a community is burning out?
Yeah, I think an easy or low-hanging fruit uh, area to pick out is just understanding what are those resources in the community or lack of those resources, because sometimes we're only as good as a helper, someone on the front line, in terms of knowing what's out there. If there's nothing else out there, the most that we can really do is listen, right? So I think listening first and foremost, and then also having that understanding of what's available in my community are those initial signs. I mean, we're talking about COVID, and getting those initial calls. If you answered 211 or other areas of community navigation, like, all right, we're picking up on patterns, something's going on. And then how did that evolve? And again, the amount of stress in our communities, the amount of anxiety, a lot of that unfortunate cloud just hovering around different communities and going at different paces. I think, really being present and hearing what the community is telling you, on those phone calls. And then that also ends up translating, because people answering the phones are those same individuals from the community, right? So it's like, all right, how do I make sure that I put on my oxygen mask, make sure I'm okay, taking care of others? But then, it becomes, and I don't know a good way to say it, but just this cloud of burnout where community's exhausted, there's no help, there's nothing else, and they're looking to us as a resource. And then sometimes we might have it, but then there's other times we know how that struggle is real. And how does that also start to burn ourselves out when I might be coming in like this is my life goal to change lives, help out people, but now I just took 100 calls in a day and I might have only been able to help out three, four, or five of them. Like I don't feel efficient. I don't feel like the work that I'm doing is valuable at this point. And now I'm feeling burnt out because these calls are still coming in and my hands feel tied. So I think those are some of those first initial signs that you see out in the community, but then again, how that overflows into us as a helpers.
Yeah, definitely. Something I really see a lot in our sector is people really internalizing that burnout as a personal failure. Like, if I were stronger, if I were more organized, more disciplined, I wouldn't feel this way. Why do you think people blame themselves instead of recognizing the systemic strain around them?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question and something that I've reflected on over the years. And in some of the groups that I'm doing, hearing similar types of, feedback. I think we know not everybody wants to do this work. Not everybody is built to do this type of work. There's something unique about, folks doing community navigation that has just this level of care, this level of compassion that they're built for this, right? They're built to do this type of work. And then once you're blocking that natural giving spirit of helping out others, I think we're always our own worst critic to say, hey, yeah, maybe let me not blame it all on the community and all these other factors that are going on. Like we start to blame ourselves, and that's easier said than done in terms of navigating those feelings and understanding ourselves and our triggers. But I think just the amount of care that we have that we're wanting to pour into others, and when that doesn't happen, sometimes it's easy to be our own worst critic. So those are my thoughts around that.
Yeah, so it definitely, can change the way we show up in our job, the way we show up on the front lines for those individuals who are needing it, because we can't really help someone in a crisis as much if we're experiencing a crisis ourselves through burnout symptoms. So,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
yeah. So, when you look at burnout through a community lens, what does that tell us about the conditions that people are living and working in?
Yeah, and I've had the privilege with doing community navigation work in, a lot of different zip codes throughout the country. And we know how you throw a dart at certain zip codes, some communities are very well off, have plenty of resources, and then you have others that unfortunately do not, right? It could be a matter of funding in that community, maybe some of our rural communities where there's like less focus in providing some of that support. So one thing that I've always noticed, and again, data, it's always helpful to look at and really understanding, all right, this is what was showing up in the data across these different zip codes, these cities, these towns, these communities, these states, and really unpacking that. And, I recall a time where, I was being intentional of finding, all right, well, where are these unmet needs coming from? Where are these other issues? How can we find solutions for that? And then unpacking those stories of why these things are happening in some communities versus others. And I think that helps inform us, you know, for, leaders of these teams, funders, the community stakeholders to say, all right, well, we have some of this data, we're hearing these stories, on a daily basis. How can we go ahead and ensure that we're truly understanding what's happening and then coming up with proactive solutions where it's realistic? Because sometimes we might have all that information, and so at the end of the day, there's no dollars. There's no dollars. How do we continue to navigate that? But um, I, I think we really need to be intentional in terms of understanding those stories that are happening across communities.
Yeah. Can you share a story of when you realized that someone's burnout wasn't about them at all? It was about the environment that they were trying to survive in?
Yeah, I mean, there have been countless of those examples. So I recall that there was one particular zip code area where there was only one resource.
Mhm.
That was easily approachable. Again, a lot of people didn't have transportation. This was kind of it for many miles, right? And something happened, unfortunately. I believe that that nonprofit had shut down. And now noticing, all right, I guess in that community, there was already like a built-in solution for that. And I believe it was around like food insecurities and a few other things. But it's like, all right, people knew where to go to. Now that moment that that went away, then more of those calls started trickling in from that community. And maybe if they get help with food, they're able to make do with some of their rent, or balance some of those things out. Then we just really started seeing like that snowball effect of people more highly agitated, people really struggling, not knowing where to turn. They heard about where to call, and hearing that, presenting that, it's like, all right, well, you know for our staff, our hands are really tied with what to do there. Yeah, we can connect them with other resources, even though if they're a little farther out, maybe finding options with transportation, other types of, assistance like with Lyft rides, or a lot of different programs available, within our network. So how are we creative with that? But yeah, we are seeing that burnout in the community. We are noticing those extra resources. And I wish to say that was just a one and done situation, but we're seeing this all across our country where very good programs either lose funding, close up their shop because again, they're not able to do other things, lose good people, just a perfect storm of things that lead to additional areas of burnout in communities where we really didn't have anything to do with it directly, but we feel like, hey, I need to help out this person. What can I do? This person doesn't have this or that. And sometimes we can be creative, other times we can't. But I think that could be a good example of seeing what I've seen firsthand.
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot today about how people who are experiencing burnout are that's the person that others are relying on, the strong one, the steady one. How does that role make burnout harder to recognize or admit?
Yeah. So I guess I'll piggyback off of something that I said a little earlier in terms of really understand the reality of things, right?
Mhm.
I know, again, both on the service delivery side versus like the community, right? There's some folks that are more optimistic than others. There's some folks that might have a higher level of resilience than others, of how to process things, of how to navigate things. And, I think on both ends, like, all right, there's an issue and we really want to have a solution to that, but how are we processing that ourselves? And I think as human beings, that's very much easier said than done. And if we're kind of like, you know, being hyper focused on certain scenarios, like if you were to throw some scenarios at me, like, all right, well, we can see maybe this unpacking this way or that unpacking that way. And I think really understanding how do we deal with the realities of things there. I mean, sometimes there is denial. Sometimes there are, the optimists in anyone is like, no, we're going to figure this out. We're going to do something. Not only of those frontline folks, but the other folks trying to like look for the help. Like, no, we're going to find something. We're going to make these calls, and I think it really comes back down to the reality of it, and then how any individual is navigating their own resilience and their own spin on how they're looking at that situation with the cup being half full or half empty.
Yeah. So let's talk about the system side for just a moment. From your perspective, what are the biggest ways that organizations are unintentionally contributing to burnout?
I think sometimes with all the excellent, amazing work that's being done, a lot of organizations sometimes find themselves in survival mode. Like, hey, we
Mhm.
need to do X, Y, Z to get these funds in again this next year. We need to make sure we're drawing down these funds and again, making sure that we're bringing in the folks and kind of doing that. I think it's just a perfect storm of things needing to go right in order to survive, right? And not to say that this is every case, but sometimes by doing that, it leads to some of this other areas of burnout and maybe even sometimes lack of communication, or there's community stakeholders or other folks in the community that might be interpreting things one way when it's really another. So I think just being able to have the bandwidth to really, okay, be intentional, because everything's important, right? It's like, all right, how do we prioritize? How do we make sure, things are okay? And I'm thinking, in my personal conversations with a lot of different programs across the country where there's some folks that will meet with me because they're really being intentional. Hey, we need to make sure our staff are okay. We need to make sure that they're good. We need to make sure that, we're refilling their cup up to make sure that they're okay. Despite all the other headaches and all the other things going on, that they're being intentional with making some of that time and exploring options, whether it's, a collaborative process with me, or if it's just like, maybe something else in their communities, right? And then you have, other organizations where, they might hear of something, they might think of something like that's a good idea, but it's just becoming so swamped in the day to day in terms of like, hey, we need the bare minimum to survive right now. And it's harder to be part of those conversations. So I don't think anyone really intends to say, yeah, it's okay if people burn out, but I think that's burnout in itself where you're not able to really, you know, take a step back, breathe a little bit and say, all right, how do we look at all these things and how can we be as intentional as possible with all of them, knowing that, all right, it might not be perfect, but we do the best that we can do with the funding that we have coming in with our team, and just kind of building that, ensuring that that perception is there, because once you're in survival mode, things get hard. And unfortunately, that's the reality of a lot of our nonprofits.
Yeah. So if leaders wanted to try to catch burnout early to maybe prevent it, what should they be paying attention to?
Yeah, so I'm happy that you're kind of like bringing that up. And I think this is the first time that I've actually shared this kind of publicly. So you're going to get this little scoop on this. But I've been having a lot of conversations with, different programs and possibly looking to pilot this. But we constantly hear burnout is everywhere. It's always happening. A lot of the reality of it is going on, but we need to push forward. We need to get through this, roll with the punches, right? But how often do we have actual quantifiable data to really back that up, to actually know and pinpoint that? So I've started what I'm coining as the voice of resilience standard, where, and we all have our CRMs, we have so many different questions, and I would encourage folks to add one more question, not for the clients that they're serving, but the actual person answering that call. Pretty much on a Likert scale, 1 to 5, for that person to identify, all right, how stressful, how overwhelming, how burnt out did that call put me in that moment? To pilot this for a certain amount of time. And again, for anyone that's listening, I'm happy to kind of share like a one pager with a lot of different areas that we can test out, actually having quantifiable data to do right by our staff. So I'll give you an example of that. You might get the average and to say, hey, the level of stress for April, across the board, across all these calls for the month, it's averaging at a 4.1, right? For the first time, you can see an average of what people are self-reporting, and you're not really spending 15 minutes after a call. It's just a couple of seconds, put it in there. And then how do you go back to your team and say, hey, we averaged a 4.1. We want to be intentional. How do we get down to, maybe let's put a goal to a 3.8, right? What are things that we can layer in there? How do we have more intentional coaching sessions? How do we have more opportunities for self-care, or building those toolkits, or talking about that? That's one example in terms of actually having quantifiable data. What can you do to go back to your funder to say, hey, this is the data around this. We need more funding to do more things for our staff. This is our goal. And seeing that, I think, goes a long way. Another example is tying that in with your data with turnover in HR, right? You might say, hey, if you're doing this long enough with enough data to say, well, we're noticing on average when it's getting to a 4.3, our turnover rates go up X percentage. Well, hey, now you have something that you can target to help, the extremely high cost of turnover and training and all those different types of things, actually having data for the first time that can back things up. So to go to your question, how do you identify? Well, for the first time ever, we can actually have data to prove that. Another example that came up with one of the other centers that we're speaking about piloting this is, well, me as a supervisor, me as a team leader, whatnot, I might be reviewing some of this data, and maybe Joy's on my team, and we're having our coaching session. I'm like, hey, Joy, you know what? Based off of this, we're running the taxonomy on the back and we're looking at this. It seems like the calls related towards food insecurity seems to be, where the highest level of stress and anxiety that's pinpointing to that. You know, let's unpack that. Let's have an open and honest conversation about that, right? Could it be, yeah, about that program shut down, there's no resources, I feel helpless. So every single time when they're asking for this in this community, my anxiety levels go up because I feel I can't help them. All right, we know how that conversation is going to go. Now we can unpack that. Or is it, yeah, there are resources in the community, but it triggers what's going on in my home because I'm struggling with X, Y, or Z. Now, this might be a whole other type of conversation, and we're using the data to really extract what does that look like, because everybody's a little different, right? It's good to see the whole picture of your team, but then on an individual basis, how are we really being intentional, and how does that also go to show, wow, my organization cares enough to know little snapshots of how I'm feeling throughout all these difficult calls. All right, it seems like the perception is that they care about me. They're being intentional with this. And how are we kind of going down this list that, again, I'm happy to share, of different opportunities of how we can pilot this and then really stand by our staff. So long-winded response for that, but that's probably an excellent clear-cut way to pinpoint what burnout is looking like on our teams.
I love that. I love the explanation you gave for the metrics for measuring burnout. I feel like that's something that a lot of teams can really use to start saying, hey, we notice this person is starting to score a little bit lower. They're starting to experience more burnout. So we need to intervene and figure out how to solve it from the organization level. And I think that's going to be groundbreaking and life-changing for so many people.
I mean, I hope so. And I'll just add this other piece in there too, because again, we can really go down a deep rabbit hole with this, but you might have people that are like, no, I'm strong. One's for everything. Nothing stresses me out. How do you also unpack that too? Because it's like, all right, so what's going on? Because again, some people, they get jaded with this type of work. That also kind of paints a picture of like, all right, how can we be intentional, embrace all of our team, no matter where they're at, and really have these deeper conversations and go from there. So again, I'm really happy and excited to kind of talk about this for the first time, in an open type of setting, and hopefully continue with this type of dialogue to make sure our folks are okay.
Absolutely. So when someone stops blaming themselves, they start seeing burnout as a signal, not a failure. What changes, what helps them to begin to heal?
It sounds cliche, but I'm sure you heard it's okay not to be okay, right?
Yeah.
Hearing certain types of wordings like that. And I think sometimes it's really taking that to heart, you know, and I'll give you an example from, the work that I do with 988 and a lot of other national crisis lines. And I remember having a training cohort, bringing them in and just kind of doing that and to say, hey, you know what? If you're here for the long haul, we hope that everyone is here for that, right? You're going to be answering hundreds, if not thousands of calls, right? And you're not going to be able to help out everybody. That's just the reality of it. You might do everything by the book. People might still not like your voice. People still might not like you because you're male or female. People might not like you for a million reasons. And it's not anything personal. It's just hurt people. And they're kind of navigating that. And I think sometimes what goes missing in onboarding and in trainings is just really understanding the reality of it. It's like, hey, yes, you came in here because you have a big heart. You want to help out others, but how do we instill that, yes, we can still do everything the best that we can? And part of the reality is that, still not going to be perfect in the eyes of like others. Um, in one of the support groups that I'm doing, someone did share the story, the starfish story, and I don't know if anyone has ever heard this or if you've heard it. Have you heard it
I have
before?
not heard it.
And it stuck with me and it stuck with the folks, on the call. But I'll use this as an opportunity to share it. Where this little girl, she's walking on the beach, and there's just hundreds of starfish everywhere, like on the beach, stranded, right? And she picks a starfish up, picks it up, throws it into the water, takes a couple more steps, picks up another one, throws it in the water, and a lady comes by. This little girl, why are you doing that? You know you're not going to be able to save all the starfish. And then she bends over, picks up another starfish, throws another. You're right, but I at least save that one. And here, I'm going to save another. And yes, we're not going to be able to save all of them, but having that perception, that mindset to say, well, even if I'm making the difference in one person's life, that goes a long way. And I think sometimes we need to remember that we do the best that we and every single day is different. But if we can at least make the difference in that life of one person, that goes a long way. And hopefully, as we continue to build awareness of these services, bring in more revenue to help fund and hire more people and do this types of work, eventually we can build something grander and bigger together. But right now, we can only do with what we have, and we need to make sure we're okay. And how do we find things in our own safety or wellness plan to make sure things are okay? Is it hey, going home and saying I'm gonna lock in 1 hour, watch my favorite TV show, I'm gonna take a step back? Is it going for a walk? Is it taking part in sports or artwork, or is it joining one of like the groups that I'm hosting? Like, there's so many different ways. Everybody navigates that a little differently, but I think it's really hearing from our leaders and just these conversations like this. It's like, hey, I know it hurts not to be able to help out everyone, and sometimes this does lead to some of that, burnout. But we're here together, and we're here to succeed together, and again, just hand in hand, we'll figure this out together.
I love that starfish story. That was absolutely amazing. I'd never heard that, but I definitely feel like it's super relevant in our industry of community navigation. You can't help everybody, but the people that you do help and that you do save, they feel the impact. They feel that.
Yeah.
So at one point or another, every single person in our industry has felt burnout, whether they realize it or not. How has your own experience with burnout shaped the way that you show up for others today?
Again, you're hitting all these amazing questions, and I really appreciate that. It's really easier said than done. You know, I remember taking calls myself many moons ago as a volunteer when I started off, and I remember, experiencing that for like the first time in this type of setting. And I just remember I'd go on my lunch break nonstop, just thinking about this last car or these scenarios and just replaying and replaying. Going home, as much as I try to leave that at work, I'm like, I hope this person's okay, and I'm hoping that's okay. And I just noticed like it took a lot of space up in terms of my thoughts, and you know, feeling anxiety, feeling stress, throughout this process of going in like on a daily basis. And I started noticing that, and I'm like, this isn't healthy, right? I need to find kind of like an intentional way to be like, hey, I need a there there's a time and a place for processing and doing all of this, but I really need to like step away, and I need to know, hey, I trust my team. They're gonna still be there. A lot of our teams are 24/7, like navigating. If they need a call back, they'll be there. Like, I can step away. I need to make sure I'm taking my breaks when warranted. If I need to step away, and you know right now, just kind of reminding folks, hey, make sure you're taking care of yourselves. You know what? If you're not focusing in on it, who else really will at the end of the day? Those triggers within yourself. You feel your heart beating fast. You feel your palms getting sweaty. Those triggers of where you're not doing okay, right? So I think when I'm showing up like for others, it's just kind of like reminding folks, like, hey, you know what? Or you just told me you've been like in 5 back-to-back meetings. We don't need to meet right now. If you want to take a little bit, I'm flexible. We can work things out and just, you know, being intentional with those moments. Again, any single time that we might notice it ourselves, I think is how I show up for others and reminding them that you got to be okay.
That is absolutely amazing. What do you wish someone had told you earlier in your journey?
So now this is one thing that I love that you asked, because honestly, there's only so much storage up here. Did someone
Mhm.
say it to me at one point, and maybe it's with all the training and everything else, it like went in one year and out the other. So I think, you know, maybe hearing it a little bit more, or being reminded of it a little bit more, and just like randomly here and there. I think that could have been, helpful, because again, sometimes unless it's like in your face, you might not think about it, right? And yes, we might go through it in training. We might say, hey, you need to do X, Y, Z, but it's like, hey, are you okay? Or, I mean, even sharing praise. I remember when I used to work with mobile response and at the crisis stabilization unit, I had an amazing supervisor that would like stop and with the most authentic voice saying, hey, you did really good work today. Thank you. Right? Took 5 seconds to do. And just remembering how that just replenished my cup, right? I
Mhm.
just kind of like hearing that, from someone that has much more experience than me at that point, and it's just like, all right, hearing those types of things serve as reminders of what I do. So even if like I might have had like a tough call or tough experience with someone, like hearing those positives and also those reminders, like, hey, you know what, you still did good. Take 5, take 15, recharge, come back. We're in this together. I, I think it's better that we all sound like broken records and continue to say that. And yeah, I would love to have heard that a little bit more, but with the bits that I did hear, and again, been part of a lot of amazing teams over the year where they were also intentional with that. I think like at the very beginning, I think that's definitely very helpful, for folks that are, you know, determining whether they want to do this work long term or not.
That is awesome. So I want to end with this. If someone listening right now just absolutely feels hopeless, they feel burned out, they think it's just them, what would you want them to hear from you?
I mean, it sounds cliche, but you're not alone. And not to say that not validating you because others feel that way, is really embracing and validating that feeling. Like, yeah, it's unfortunately it's normal to feel that way at one point or another when you have so much that you want to give and you want to be able to help out others. And I think understanding that is all right, be focusing on yourself, what works, what doesn't work. And again, I go back to, these groups that I'm piloting, and, I'd have people from like 4 or 5 different states, like attending at one time, all apart different teams. And, they're telling me, wow, it's nice to hear that I'm not alone. I thought all of this was just like, I thought the grass was greener on the other side. And like, no, it's like everywhere, unfortunately. And, knowing that, whatever hat that we are wearing, that, we do the best that we can do, and just knowing who our people are, right? Always looking for the helpers, and what better way than looking at other helpers? A lot of us, that operate 211 or 988, right? If you're going through something, it's a little hard to pick up and dial those numbers when it's your coworkers or your peers answering those phone calls, right? So it's like, all right, what other opportunities are there? So again, I just want people to know that there are options out there, even if it's, participating in some of these groups that I'm running for, wellness and support for our frontline staff. Just again, there's so many options out there, and even internally with teams, I know a lot of teams also have, you know, um, small processing groups that they might do, or other tools in terms of wellness. If you're not familiar, you need a reminder what's going on in your own shop. It's okay to ask your supervisor, your team leader, like to say, hey, are we doing anything for wellness or self-care that I might be able to pick up or incorporate? Like, let's continue to have these conversations like we are today, and know that we're not alone, and we are here for one another.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know I said that was going to be the last question, but you are going to be hosting a breakout session at the 2026 Inform USA conference that's going to be in Louisville in just a couple of weeks. Could you tell me a little bit about what that's going to be covering and just give me a quick synopsis of it?
Yeah, definitely. And again, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, very excited to be at Inform USA again. Wonderful accrediting body for our network, and a lot of great leaders that hear, all right, what do people want to present? And I was fortunate enough to submit my submission to talk about these groups, right? These national support groups for frontline teams, and really going more in depth on what I shared with you about the Voice of Resilience standard, in terms of like, how do we get data around that, and how do we kind of use this as a tool. Again, every single center is different, but you know the feedback that I've heard about this is like, yeah, we needed something like this 5 years ago. How come nothing like this has ever existed on this national scale and independently, where I'm outside of my organization? I feel safe. As much as I might trust or have that rapport with my supervisors, there are certain things that I wouldn't want them to know about me personally, right? So how do we build these personal safe spaces for anyone across this network, make that available? So we're really happy to kind of like jump in, share a little bit more about what was uncovered in the first phase, but also the second phase that's currently happening right now, and how do we make this an ongoing resource for our team. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that. And yeah, happy to further these discussions, with a lot of amazing teams and peers that will be joining us just in a few weeks.
Absolutely. I am really excited to attend your session. I already have it saved to my agenda in the Hoover app. So
Awesome.
I will be there sitting front row for sure. Richard, thank you so much for
Thank
bringing your
you.
voice, your honesty, your lived experience to this conversation.
I appreciate you, and looking forward to more of this series as you're speaking to a lot of other experts in this world of work that we do. So thank you for all that you do as well.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for listening in on this podcast episode, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Community Navigation in Action. I'm really grateful you spent part of your day here digging into the real work behind community navigation and the systems that support it. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow me on social media and subscribe to my Spotify. I share more behind the scenes insights, upcoming topics, and ways we can strengthen the navigation ecosystem together.